Let's talk about a mission that sounds like something straight out of a movie. A mission where you take an old warship, pack it with explosives, and turn it into a massive time bomb. This is a story about a plan so audacious, so incredibly daring, it was basically a one-way trip for most involved. Welcome to the story of Operation Chariot.
But you know what? We're not going to start at the beginning. We're going to start with the bang. Picture this. It's the morning of March 28, 1942. The French port of Saint-Nazaire is under German control. A chaotic British raid had just happened the night before, but things have quieted down now. The Germans are surveying the damage, feeling like they've got everything under control. But the raid, it wasn't really over. Hours after the fighting stopped, as German officers and curious onlookers were crawling all over this wrecked British destroyer that was wedged into the main dock gate, the ship just vanished. An unbelievable explosion rips the entire port apart, killing hundreds of German personnel and completely obliterating the massive steel gate, the single most important piece of naval infrastructure on the entire Atlantic coast.
So yeah, that brings us to the big question, right? How on earth did that happen? How did the British Navy manage to sneak one of their own ships, stuffed with explosives, deep into enemy territory and deliver a single, perfectly timed, devastating blow?
To get that answer, we've got to rewind a bit. Because to understand why they'd even try something so crazy, you have to understand the massive problem the Allies were facing in the Atlantic. This whole mission, it wasn't really about a dock. It was about hunting an apex predator. And here she is. Meet the Tirpitz. If you've heard of her sister ship, the Bismarck, you know what we're talking about. This thing was an absolute monster, a floating fortress that gave Allied command nightmares. Just the threat of her breaking out into the Atlantic meant the Royal Navy had to keep a huge number of their own ships on standby just watching and waiting. She was a weapon of incredible power that barely had to fire a shot to be effective.
But like any great beast, the Tirpitz had one critical weakness. A ship that big needs a really, really big garage for repairs. And on the entire Atlantic coast, from Norway all the way down to Spain, there was only one place that could fit her, the Normandy dock in Saint-Nazaire. Take out that dock, and suddenly the Tirpitz is a cage beast. It can't risk coming out to fight in the Atlantic, because if it gets so much as a scratch, there's nowhere for it to go for repairs.
So there's the puzzle for Allied command. You have one target, a single dock gate, that can effectively neutralize this massive battleship. But that target is buried deep inside one of the most heavily defended ports in Europe. Bombing it from the air, not accurate enough back then. A full frontal naval assault, that would be a slaughter. They needed a cleverer, almost unthinkable way in.
And the plan they cooked up, well, it was so audacious it was genuinely nuts. This was a plan born from sheer desperation and absolute brilliance, coming from the new Combined Operations Command. Okay, get this. The plan had 4 basic steps. First, take an old, hand-me-down American destroyer and make it look like a German ship. Second, cram its nose with over 4 tons of high explosives set on a delayed timer. Third, sail it right up the enemy-controlled river and just ram it full speed straight into the dock gate. And fourth, as if that wasn't enough, have commandos leap off the ship and destroy everything else in sight. Seriously, it was a suicide mission.
And this was the crew they sent to do it. Just over 600 men, sailors and commandos, on the Campbeltown, and a small fleet of what were essentially wooden speedboats. This wasn't an invasion force. It was a scalpel being sent to do surgery inside a fortress.
So they start their run up the river, trying to bluff their way past German sentries. It was this incredibly tense, silent journey, creeping right into the heart of a hornet's nest. But that kind of luck, it just couldn't last.
And it didn't. At 1:22 in the morning, just miles from the target, their cover is blown. The entire riverbank erupts with cannon and machine gun fire. But somehow, through that hellstorm, just 12 minutes later, the Campbeltown hits its target, smashing into the gate. The commandos pour ashore, but the plan is already falling apart. The little wooden boats meant to get them out are being shredded by gunfire. The evacuation plan collapses.
What started as a stealth mission just became a brutal, point-blank firefight. The run-in turned into a mad dash through a hail of shells. You have to imagine the scene. Pure, absolute chaos, lit up by explosions and tracer fire, fought with just unbelievable, desperate heroism.
So the main objective? It was actually a success. The Campbeltown was in place. The commandos did their demolition work. But that success? It came at a staggering, almost unimaginable human cost. Let's just look at the numbers, because they're absolutely brutal. Of the 611 men who went on that raid, 169 were killed. Another 215 were captured.
Only 227, just over a third, made it back home. The price for that dock gate was incredibly high.
And this right here is the central paradox of Operation Chariot. If you look at it tactically, on the ground that night, it was a disaster. A massive casualty rate, a failed evacuation, most of the boats lost. But if you zoom out and look at the big picture, the strategy, it was one of the most brilliant successes of the war. The Tirpitz was neutralized without ever being touched. The dock was gone for good. Allied morale went through the roof.
So what's the lasting legacy of a raid like this? It's more than just a clever strategic move. It really comes down to the raw human courage that was on display that night.
And nothing proves that more than this number, 5. For this one single night of fighting, 5 Victoria Crosses, Britain's absolute highest award for valor, were awarded. That makes this one of the most decorated actions in all of British military history.
These went to the leaders, the men in charge, who somehow held this impossible plan together. But they also went to guys like Sergeant Thomas Durrant. He was on one of the motor launches, mortally wounded, but he just refused to leave his gun. He stayed there, providing covering fire so that others might have a chance to escape. It was that kind of selfless courage, multiplied across the force, that made this raid legendary.
And that legendary status was sealed by the man who planned it all, Lord Mountbatten, the head of Combined Operations. He would later call it, quite simply, the greatest raid of all.
Which leaves us with one last, tough question to think about. We've seen the brutal cost, but we've also seen the massive strategic win. So when is a mission with a casualty rate of over 60% considered not just a success, but a historic triumph? That's the difficult, complicated calculus at the very heart of the legend of St. Nazaire.